Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Alex, story we ride the stories of the West campfire. Truth's trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The dust inside the little church in Mesquite Bend tasted like chalk and sap. It clung to tongues and cuffs and the backs of throats. Ceiling fans turned slow, the belts squeaking. The bell outside hit a tired note that did not match the hymn. Tuesday noon, 6 months without rain. June Hart stood beside the pulpit with her hands folded at her waist. The lace at her wrists was secondhand and too tight. Reverend Jonah Hart read fast from his worn Bible lips, white at the corners, voice flattening the vows into one long line. He did not look at his daughter. He looked at the page. Her mother Miriam sat in the first pew, with a bonnet that did not fit right anymore, her cheekbones sharper than June remembered from last spring. Barlow Kane held June's hand like he owned it. His thumb pressed the ridge of her knuckles. He wore a black coat that smelled of horse and smoke. A gold band weighted in his palm, heavy and dull. When he inhaled, June caught whiskey under the mint. His eyes were pale and opaque like creek ice. On the pulpit lay a ledger bound in cracked red leather. A ribbon stuck out sealed with a blob of wax. No one mentioned it. The pages hummed in June's head anyway. Debts, numbers, due. Do you, Barlow Kane, take this woman? Reverend Jonah said, the words running together. He did not raise his eyes. I do, Barlow said. And do you, June Hart, take this man? Her father said softer. June fixed her gaze on the wooden cross above his shoulder. The varnish was chipped. A fly walked the arm. She tasted resin and heat. Her mouth would not open. Barlow pressed her fingers again. Not a question, a reminder. I do, she said. Her voice left her and went nowhere in the dusty air. The ring slid onto her finger. It was too large. It tilted and knocked against the next finger with a small metallic ping that sounded too bright. People in the pews did not smile. They did not speak. Someone coughed. Outside, the street wavered in the heat. Barlow did not bring a buggy. He took June by the elbow and walked her down the steps and along the boardwalk. June kept her balance by watching a cracked knot in the plank. He did not slow when they reached open dirt. The town looked away. A man at the mercantile stacked crates with careful noise. A woman fanned herself and pretended to see a stain on her glove. Barlow's ranch house sat at the edge of everything. The windows faced the flats. The shutters were straight. The fence posts were set deep. The front door was painted the kind of green you pick out of a catalog to show you have money. Inside the house was the smell of tobacco that never leaves and old coffee and leather oil. A house girl slid out of sight. Barlow nodded toward the stairs. Up, he said. June lifted the hem of her dress. Her shoes were thin. The runner on the steps had a pattern of vines that climbed and died and climbed again. On the landing, a single window showed a piece of white sky like a scrap of cloth. He opened a door. The room was plain and cold. A bed frame made of dark wood, a washstand with a pitcher, a wardrobe with a mirror that made June look like she was underwater. A candle waited unlit. The curtains were drawn tight. On a peg near the wardrobe hung a quirt, oil dark and coiled. Not a belt to hold up anything. A thing for control. June's jaw went hard before her mind could catch up. She did not move her eyes, only took in what light gave her. The nightstand drawer stood a finger width open. Inside, polished steel puzzled the dark. Cuffs. The chain lay like a smile. Barlow shut the door and turned the key. The sound clicked once and then settled into the wood. He did not look at her when he crossed to the washstand. He poured from a cut glass bottle and drank, then set the bottle down with a soft knock. Take it off, he said. June breathed too fast. The dress buttons were small and slick. Her fingers would not feel them right. She turned her back because she needed to see the buttons. She stared at the thread loops and thought of nothing but thread. She tugged the first loop and missed. She tried again and caught it. 1, 2. Her skin prickled under the lace. Slow, Barlow said. His voice was calm. He sat on the bed and the ropes creaked. June's eyes slid to the window. The glass had bubbles trapped in it. The putty had shrunk away, leaving a hairline gap at the frame. A thin thread of air moved against her neck. The world beyond that pane had no faces in it. Her mother's hands had mended this dress by lamplight. June could see the stitches in the side seam. She had watched those hands tremble. She had carried a basin to catch the tea leaves, while her father whispered numbers and scripture into the same air. June's thumb fumbled another button. The quirt on the peg did not move. The cuffs did not move. She felt them in her teeth. Turn around, Barlow said. Don't said. She did not. She reached the candle instead. The match flared sulfur and stung her nose. Light took shape in the room. Shadows leaned long against the wall. The metal in the drawer winked like an eye and then went blank. Barlow stood. His boots bit the boards. He was not in a hurry. June kept her hand on the candlestick. Wax ran warm over her knuckles. The wick leaned and righted itself. She thought about the door. Thick. She thought about the key. Iron. Her heart drummed so loud she could not hear the fan belts anymore, or the bell, or the town. She did not remember picking up the pitcher. It was in her hand and it was heavy. The ceramic looked harmless until it was not. She did not think of aiming. She threw. It hit the wall short and burst white shards bouncing under the bedwater, slapping the floor and her skirts. Barlow did not shout. He smiled without his eyes. Nowhere to go, he said. The window was behind her shoulders. The glass trembled at a step. The gap in the putty breathed on her again. June took one step to the chair by the wall. She gripped the back. The wood was smooth where hands had held it before. The chair was light enough to move and heavy enough to matter. She lifted. The legs scraped and left scars on the floor. Barlow came toward her like a man approaching a fence. He measured. He kept his balance over his heels. June swung with all the weight of her fear. The chair struck the pane, and the glass gave in with a flat surprise sound. Air hit her feet. The smoke of the match went fast. Broken edges stuck in the sash, bright as teeth. The curtain blew and snapped. Barlow swore once. It was not loud. June climbed onto the sill. The wood dug into her knees through the lace. The veil snagged on a nail and tore away. She did not feel the cuts until they warmed. Her whole body wanted out into the raw air that did not have whiskey in it. A yard waited below, baked pale and seeded with dead stems. The world smelled like dust and iron and sun. Barlow's hand caught the skirt. June ripped. Seams popped. She shoved through the frame and the glass bit her wrists and her thighs and the small of her back. The drop was not far. It took her breath anyway. She landed in the flower bed that had been neglected into dirt. The impact knocked the ring hard against bone. She rolled and scrambled to her feet. The gravel chewed her knees. A rose cane without roses snagged her and held. She tore free and left lace behind. The green door above was still a rectangle in the dark clapboard. The key turned again. The sound was neat and clean. June ran across the yard. The barn stood still with its big mouth and its flies. The sun had slid, and the first length of shade cut the path like a river. Boots thudded somewhere behind her. A dog barked near the bunkhouse, and then another answered. Her lungs burned. Her palms stung. Her own blood smelled like a penny. She did not look back. The fence at the edge of the yard had a low place where a board had loosened. She put her hands on the top rail and threw her weight over. Her skirt caught. She kicked and felt fabric give. A strip of lace stayed on a splinter, fluttering like a moth. When her feet hit the far side, the ground was different. Mesquite. Sand. The town stopped a few yards behind. Wind touched her face and was not stale. She filled her chest with it and ran toward the brush where the land kept its own counsel. Brush slapped June's shins and filled her shoes with sand. The air tasted of chalk and creosote. She ran with her hands out and her head low. The ruined veil snarled around her wrist like a strip of fog. Behind her, a door banged once, and boot heels hit the porch boards in a hard rhythm. A dog bayed near the bunkhouse, high and ragged, and more voices joined in, flaring and fading like sparks. She skirted a mesquite clump, and the thorns reached for her skirt. The lace ripped again. The sound was small and final, like a page tearing. The yard's last fence sank away. Open ground spread out in a shallow tilt toward the foothills, and trembling under heat that clung even as the light fell. A gust moved over the flats and lifted the hair on her neck. It smelled cleaner out here, mineral and dry. Lanterns, someone called. Take 2 to the creek, Barlow says, breathing. Another voice said, closer and amused. The rest is optional. June kept her eyes on the dark seam where brush thickened. A cicada rasp came in waves. Her lungs felt like 2 fists working too hard. She had to pull her dress up with both hands to keep from stepping on it. She held the skirt in her teeth and tasted dust and the sour of her own blood. A long shadow rushed over the ground and she flinched. A vulture lifted off a dead stump and beat away toward the flats. The motion shook something loose in her legs. She pushed on. The first stones of the foothills found her bare feet and did not forgive. Slate sliced. Grit dug in. She reached a dry wash choked with sage and yucca. The wash had a soft floor and steep sides. It would hide a girl if a girl could get down fast. She slid on her hip, and dirt poured into her shoes. The scent of crushed sage rose up like a prayer. She crawled on elbows for a few yards and stopped to listen. Footsteps somewhere above clanked tack, and a lantern's glow swam over the lip. Sand glinted in little points. She pressed her cheek to the cool ground and swallowed her breath. "Tracks," a rider said. "Small feet. She bleeds some." "Quiet the dogs," another said. "You scare her. She goes to ground." June pressed deeper into the sage until the points bit her arms. A moth knocked itself against her ear, then spiraled toward the glow and vanished. The lantern's light washed the rim and slid on. The horse nearest her blew through its nose. That wet cotton sound. She could smell its banded leather and old sweat and the iron cold of the bit. The dog whined, breath huffing. June did not move her ribs, not in the wash, the first voice said. She kept east. "There's a gentler grade to the arroyo." Boots thumped. Lantern light shrank. The wash darkened again into a blue that was almost black. Sound thinned to the insect saw, and the far pull of a nightbird. June pushed herself to hands and knees. Her palms were a mess of grit and tiny cuts, skin tugging where glass had kissed her. The ring knocked once against the packed earth. A cheap bell. She curled her fingers so it could not speak again. She crawled until she cleared the tangle, then stood and went where the ground fell away toward the arroyo. A band of cottonwoods marked it dark against a lighter strip of sky. The world smelled damp in the way only dry riverbeds do at night, a stored coolness that sits just above the dust. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered without conviction. Her breath came back in pieces. She counted the pieces. 10 to the next bush, 10 to the next rock. When she missed her count, she chose a new one. Crickets scissored at each other. Something small scurried under brush and scolded her with its tail. Her dress dragged at her knees. She found the seam her mother had strengthened and tore along it to free herself. The sound made heat move across her face, as if the act were shameful. She kept tearing. Lanterns fanned wide behind her now and farther apart. The riders were splitting to work low ground and hill. Voices went thin with distance, and then deeper again as they struck the arroyo wall, and their shouts bounced back. June felt the vibration come through her soles. The arroyo took her in a low corridor cut by old storms. The sand there was flour-soft, then fickle. She sank to her ankles and then skated over crust that broke without warning. Cottonwood roots reached from the bank like ribs. She scaled a slope using both hands and her knees. At the top, she lay flat and let her pulse slow until it was not roaring in her ears. She looked up through a lattice of branches. Stars were coming on. The first chill slid under her dress like a thin blade. An owl passed silent above her. The wings were a shadow and a hush. She thought of the church fan and its slow belts and the ladder of verse her father had climbed. Her hand tightened on a twig until the bark crumbled. She let it go and wiped her palm on her skirt. She moved again adrift north and west, away from the line of the creek. The ground rose. The brush grew sparser and the rocks more honest about their edges. She sucked at a split in her lower lip and found grit there, too. Her tongue stung. When she swallowed, the muscles at the base of her skull ached as if she had been holding her head too still. The smell out here shifted to juniper and old ash from some past fire. The moon found a break in the cloud. It climbed and put a pale wash on stone just enough to show ledges and gaps. June used the light and climbed a shelf 1 foot at a time. On the third step, her shoe finally gave up. The seam at the toe opened like a mouth. Her soles felt the world clear through. A slice of slate took a ribbon off her heel. She made a sound like a cough and then had to bite her jaw to stop more. The taste of copper jumped in again. Horse bells tinked somewhere lower down. Not fancy bells. The bit against a tooth, maybe. A dog spoke once and was shushed. Men, as shadows moved along the line of cottonwoods, looking small as figures on a map. Up here, the wind was honest. It came over the ridge with a bite. It crawled inside the wet places at her wrists and scaled the tender skin behind her knees. She thought about the stove in the ranch kitchen and the heat that hung there even on days you did not fire it. The thought made the cold feel meaner. Her mind shrank to little decisions. That rock, that scrub, that crack in the shelf. Her body did what it had to do badly and then found another grip. Once she slipped and went to her elbow. The bone thudded. Dirt filled the sleeve. She lay there and counted to 12 and then to 12 again. She pushed up with the heel of the hand that hurt less. A lizard sat 2 inches from her fingers and did not run. It looked like a stone with a pulse. When she crested the next rise, the ground opened. Not a plateau, but a wind-polished shoulder. From here she could see the town lights small as embers laid out under a dark lid. The bell was silent now. The ranch was a set of squares and rectangles cut against the pale. She saw the roofline that had held her a few minutes earlier, or a lifetime earlier, and her stomach dropped like she had stepped off. She turned her face from it. Her breathing had gone narrow. The air got in but did not quite do its work. She tasted the sour of fear and the thin metal of effort. The sky was clear, except for a smear over the peaks. She could hear it move, a sound like paper rubbed between fingers. The hem of her dress clung to her legs in damp patches, where she had sweated and where the pitcher water had soaked her. Dust had crusted there into a paste. She walked the length of the shoulder and found a cut where the rock had cracked and drift gathered. The crack made a crooked cradle. She bit at the knot on her wrist and freed the rag of veil. She thrust it into the gap to make it softer. When she lowered herself, the grit ground into her wounds and she hissed. The noise took the last of her breath. She lay on her side with her knees up, and her hands tucked under her chin to keep them warm. The ring cool against her lip where her fist pressed it. Below, a horse snorted, then settled. The sound reached her, as if through cloth. The lanterns moved like far bees. The wind lifted the hair at her ear and found the sweat there and turned it cold. Her teeth began to chatter in little stutters she could not stop. She tried to count again, but the numbers slid around. She fixed her eyes on a sharp star until the star blurred and doubled. Her body shivered and then checked and then started again. The smell of sage was thick in the crack, and the dust at her nose was fine as flour. It caked her lips. She pulled one hand out long enough to swipe it away, then tucked the hand back under her chin. Her nails scratched her own skin and left a stripe. The scratch felt like someone else's hand. The rock under her cheek held the day's warmth for a breath or two, then let it go. The cold climbed with patience. June pulled her knees closer to her belly. Her eyes slid shut and opened once and slid shut again. Her last thought was not a word. It was a picture of a window with no glass in it and a square of sky where nothing had a latch. Dawn thinned the dark to iron. The ridge smelled like juniper and old ash. A gray gelding stood hip-shot on the shale ears, forward steam curling from his nostrils. His name was Ghost, and he held still when his rider lifted a hand. Trace Walker scanned the slope. A strip of white lay crooked against dark stone the size of a fallen yearling. It was not snow. He slid the rifle from its scabbard and moved in a half-crouch. Boots found purchase where goatweed clung. A magpie scolded once from a dead limb and hopped away. Up close, the white was a dress in shreds, a girl curled into herself with her knees pulled tight. Her hair was tangled with sand and seed heads. Skin showed where lace had failed, cold and gray at the joints. Blood had dried in thin lines over her ankles. Splinters of glass still shone at a wrist. Trace set the rifle down within reach and touched 2 fingers to her throat. The skin was cold. The pulse was there, a faint tap. He leaned close to her mouth and felt the softest warmth against his cheek. She smelled like dust and copper and a sweet old soap that had failed to hold. "Ma'am," he said low, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. No answer came that he could use. He looked back along the ridge. Lanterns far below moved like fireflies over the arroyo. Men were talking to their horses in that clipped way riders do. He could pick out only the shape of the sounds. He swore into the cold. Ghost flicked an ear at the word. Trace slid his arms under the girl, one behind her knees, one at her shoulders. Her body felt like a bundle of dry sticks. When he lifted, the dress crackled. Heat lived under the chill of her skin, a fever that felt wrong. She made a small sound and let it go. He walked the few yards to Ghost and eased her across the saddle in front of him. The gelding shifted at the strange weight and then squared up. Trace looped the reins through his fingers and gathered the girl against his chest to brace her. He could feel her heart through the ruined lace. It tapped fast and then staggered and then found fast again. They took the backside of the ridge where the basalt broke into shelves. There was a narrow cut in the rock that hid a path and a door. Trace found it by feel. He tapped the heel of his hand against a stone and felt the sound come back hollow. He pushed, and a panel of weathered planks gave an inch. The door opened into a low room built tight against the rock, so that the ridge itself was one wall. It smelled like old smoke and oil and pelts that had hung too long. The hearth was stone and full of dead ash. A cot took the length of one wall, ropes under a thin tick wool blankets folded at the foot. An iron nail by the door held a tin cup and a loop of rawhide. A little window sat high under the eave and admitted a blade of pale light. Trace carried the girl to the cot and set her down so that her feet were near the firebox. He crouched crumpled paper from a flour sack and set it under kindling he had split long before. The match top flared and stung the air with sulfur. Flame found curls of cedar and then settled into a steady orange. Heat began to push against the night. He hung the blackened kettle over the new flame and scooped snow from a box by the door, packed tight where the rock kept it. The first melt made a harsh ring against iron. He moved to the table and brought a torn shirt and a small tin that smelled of pine and wild herbs thick with resin. He sat on a stool near the girl's feet and said the single thing that felt right. "You are safe," he said, very flat, so the room would keep it. She did not answer. He lifted one foot into his palm and turned it to the light. Blood had dried into all the fine cracks in her sole, and the skin was cut into maps where she had left the road. He dipped a strip of cloth in hot water and wrung it until it steamed. He washed gently. The water lifted the grit and the blood at once, and when it dripped off his fingers, it made dots on the boards. The girl flinched and tried to pull away. Her eyes opened a slit and then wider. They were dark and wild. "Easy," he said. "Just warm water." She looked past him, beyond him, to a place where the room was not. Her lips moved. The words were hardly sound. "The belt," she whispered. "The drawer." Trace felt the shape of that and did not let it in. He kept his hands even and worked the cloth along the cut. He found a shard of glass small as a seed at her heel and teased it out with the tip of a knife he had warmed by the fire. The steel was clean and the metal gave back the flame's color. She hissed once and was quiet. He worked the salve into the worst cuts and wrapped her feet with clean strips. He did the same for her hands. Brown flecks on her fingers were blood and something that looked like dirt from a windowsill. He had to slide her ring off to bind one knuckle. The band was a cheap, heavy thing that had hammered the bone in a fall. He set it by the lamp, not careless and not careful, and covered the hand. He touched the kettle to listen. It said it was ready. He poured a cup and set it aside to cool, then gave Ghost a measure of grain from a sack, and rubbed the horse's neck until the old gelding sighed and leaned into the touch. He shut the door and lifted the beam into place. The bar thumped and settled. The room drew itself in a little tighter around the firelight. When he came back to the cot, the girl had one hand free and was picking at the sheet like it could tell her something. He slid an arm behind her shoulders and lifted just enough to put the cup to her mouth. She swallowed twice and choked and then tried again. A trickle wet the corner of her lip. He tipped the cup back. "No more yet," he said. "You will wear yourself out with too much." Her gaze finally found him enough to settle on his face. The fever had set a shine there that made her look both younger and older at once. She brought her free hand up and fumbled at her throat as if to check what was still hers. "Did you?" She said, the sound thin and rough. "No," he said at once. "Hands and feet, that is all." The line between her brows eased half a finger. She lowered her hand. Her eyes slid to the fire and stayed there. He pulled the wool blankets up to her shoulders. "You rest," he said. "Name can wait. Bleeding cannot." He took the stool by the hearth and set the rifle beside him with it in reach, then pulled the bolt and checked it by habit. The metal smelled like oil and smoke. He set it back, then took out his knife and a stone and pulled edge to grit with slow strokes. The sound filled the room in a careful pattern. Outside, wind ran up the ridge and tugged at the eaves. She slept, but not deep. Her breath snagged now and then, and she would say a word that did not carry a picture he could use. He stacked wood so the fire would hold and leaned his shoulder against the stone. The heat got into his shirt and then into him. He closed his eyes for a count and then opened them again when the kettle spit. The next light was pale and even. Ghost stamped and shook his mane just outside the dull thud of hoof on packed earth. Trace pushed the door open a crack and saw a sky boiled with low gray. Snow rode it in small, close flakes that darted and then settled. He shut the door and set the beam. The girl woke with a small start and a catch in her throat. Her eyes took in the ceiling, the beam above the cot, the single high window. She turned her head. He had set a tin mug of broth on the hearth to keep warm, and it sent up a lazy curl of steam. "Drink," he said. She tried to sit, and the world punished her. He caught her with a hand behind her shoulder again and slid the mug to her mouth. She sipped and closed her eyes and let the heat do its work from the inside out. The broth smelled like bone and onion and sage. She regarded him over the rim and lowered the cup. Her voice had found a body. "Who are you?" she asked. "Trace Walker," he said. "This is my cabin in the rock. Where am I?" "Backside of Black Basalt," he said. "A good ways from Mesquite Bend if you walk the hard way." She set the cup down and held it with both hands for the heat. She watched him the way a stray watches a boot. Her mouth trembled, then steadied. "What do you want?" she said, and the words were plain and sharp. He wiped his knife clean and set it aside. "Coffee," he said, "and for you to stop bleeding." He poured a little coffee into a second tin and blew across it. He took one drink and set it on the table. The brand at his shoulder blade itched under his shirt, that old spot that always woke when the air was heavy with storm. He rolled his shoulder once to make the itch a thing he could ignore. The girl's gaze slid toward his hands. He could see she was taking the measure of the nails, the scars, the long veins raised by cold. She touched the bandage on her arm and winced at the pull. "I came through your door," she said, as if testing a fact. "You came through the cold," he said. "I brought you through the door." Her eyes flicked to the latch. The beam was in its groove. That thing a locked door does to a body, walked through her face and then left. He moved and lifted the beam and left it leaning against the wall, then returned to his stool. The latch sat easy. "You can go if you wish," he said, "but not yet. It is snowing hard." She watched the door for a few heartbeats and then looked back at the fire. She rubbed her hands together under the blanket and found a place for them near her throat. "The men," she said, "careful now. Do they know this place?" "No," he said. "They do not find it if they do not already know to look. And I have not told them." She nodded once as if that matched a piece she held. Her attention went to the ring on the table and then jumped away from it like a hand off a hot iron. "Thank you," she said so quietly that the fire took half the word. He inclined his head, not polite and not impolite. A gust hit the wall, and snow tapped the little window, a sound like fingers on glass. The room held warm and close. He saw her eyes track that sound and then return. "I do not touch a woman unless she asks me," Trace said into the space between breaths. Clear and plain. She looked at him full then, and something wary eased by a shade he could see. Her hands settled. The pulse under her jaw was still quick, but not as wild. "My name is June," she said. "June and Harcourts." He let the name sit in the room like a small, clean thing and nodded once. "June," he said to fix it. He put another stick on the fire and watched it catch. Snow thickened in the high window. The stove ticked as iron changed its mind about heat. The cabin drew in and the world beyond the basalt blurred to white. Snow pressed against the little window until the world was a square of white. The wind pulled at the eaves in long ropes. Smoke curled where the draw of the chimney took hold, and the cabin warmed by inches. June tried sitting up without help. The bandages on her feet tugged and then settled. Trace laid a folded shirt across the cot, a flannel gone thin at the seams, and a pair of trousers with a cut rope for a belt. "Yours," he said, "until you can argue with a needle." She slid the shirt on. It swallowed her and held heat. The trousers felt strange under the dress, then safer. She rolled the cuffs until her ankles showed white and wrapped. He looked at her hands without looking at her. She could tell by the way his jaw went quiet. "Walk if you can," he said, "not far." She stood, and the room tipped a little. The heat from the hearth made her dizzy and then steadied her. She put a palm to the stone and used it to take 2 careful steps. The grit underfoot had its own sound. She breathed slow, felt her ribs move like wood slats. Trace set a stool near the fire. She sat and watched his hands build the day. Coffee hissed through wet grounds. He cut a curl of bacon and laid it in a pan, and the fat sang and gave off a smell that seemed too big for such a small strip. The cabin walls caught that smell and saved it. "Your mother's name was Miriam," she said, surprising herself. He cut the flame under the kettle with a stick of wood and did not glance up. The bacon crackled. "How he said?" "In the church," she said. "Everyone knows everyone's names there. They said her name when they asked me mine." He set a tin plate in her lap. There was a crust of fried bread under the bacon soaked through and hot. She ate with small bites and then bigger ones. The salt made her feel more solid. "This stove is yours," she said. "That was my mother's in the parsonage. Mine most days," he said. "Yours when you need it." The snow thickened until it tapped the window with soft, steady fingers. June watched it gather and slide, a rhythm that matched something in her chest. She drained the last of the coffee and licked a dark line from her thumb. Trace pulled a packet from a shelf and set it on the table. Flour. Another tin held rough soda. He put both beside the hearth and left his hand there a moment to feel the heat. "You can make flatbread," he said, "if you want." June stared at the flour and felt her mother's hands fussing at hers in another kitchen. She stood again and found the bowl and worked water in with the flour until it came together. She burned the first piece. The second was pale and damp in the middle. She brushed ash off the third and tried a smaller flame and a longer wait. The fourth came off the stone with a sound like a small sigh and held when she tore it. Trace broke a corner and chewed. Good, he said. The word was simple and true, and it lay where she could see it. She took another bite and felt it go down and become part of her. He showed her the rifle before noon. He checked the load and eased the hammer and set it stock down on the floor by the hearth with his hand on the barrel. The metal warmed slowly, a smell of oil and heat. You do not need this today, he said, but you should know its shape. She touched the stock with 2 fingers. The wood was smooth where other hands had curled there. He set her fingers right and moved them away. Stock to shoulder, he said, cheek on wood. Do not jerk. Breathe, then squeeze. If you pull, you miss and hurt yourself too. She nodded and held the shape without fear and without skill and set it down again. He sat to clean his traps with a cloth and an awl and a toe knife that had been broken and sharpened too many times. He worked in a rhythm that made the room feel even. June found a broom made of sage and willow and pushed ash and grit to the door and lifted the latch and swept it out. Wind threw a fist of cold, and she set the latch again and leaned the beam only close, not locked. The simple act pushed something dark back a step. In the afternoon, steam filled the room. Trace had hauled 2 buckets of snow and set them to melt and then to warm. He took a blanket and hung it on nails to make a corner and set the tin tub there and left a shirt and a cloth. He stepped outside. The cabin went very quiet. June climbed into the tub and washed the dust off slowly. The bandages stayed on her feet, and she could not reach under them without crying out, so she did not try. She cleaned her arms where glass had scratched. She poured water over her hair and watched it turn from a tangle of tan dust to dark to black. The steam carried a clean smell that was not quite familiar and not strange. She dressed in the flannel again and wrung her hair into a towel. When she was done, she took the blanket from the nails and folded it over the chair. Her skin glowed under the shirt, and she felt alive all over in a way that made her want to cry and laugh at once. Trace came in with his head down against the wind and shut the door. He hung his coat, set his hat on a peg, and glanced at the tub like a man looking at a creek in winter. He poured fresh water, tested it with a finger, and kept his back to her as he scrubbed. The water slopped over his shoulders and ran in tracks. He worked fast and then slower, as if the heat had surprised him. June looked at the fire, and then away, and then did not look away. Steam softened the sharp planes of his back. Scars laid their own map over him. He lifted his head once and looked across the room through the steam. The gaze caught her and found her open eyes. Color rose under his beard. He turned his face and reached for a towel. The kettle clicked as it cooled. June rose and moved to the table. A corner of paper stuck from under a folded shirt in a shelf cubby. It was tan and friable, and the edge was blackened. Before she knew she had done it, she had touched it with a nail and pulled it a fraction. A face on cheap ink, a name half-baked. Texa and the rest burned away. A word she could still read, wanted. Trace dried his hair with the towel and turned and saw her hand there. His eyes went flat like a river, with a strong current under it. He crossed the room once. He took the paper and slid it back into shadow, not rough. Old trouble, he said. She nodded. The room had gone very quiet again. It is not mine to know, she said. He let out a breath he had been holding since he was a boy and did not know he held. He folded the towel, set it on the back of a chair, and sat. The fire leaned and dropped and then steadied. The snow at the window was a steady white pressure. They fell into a plain life. June mended a tear at a cuff with a needle she found in a wooden matchbox. Trace straightened hooks along the wall and oiled the hinge so the door would lie easy. He cut more kindling than they needed for that day and stacked it in a tidy run. She rinsed the tin plates at the bucket and set them upside down on the table edge. By evening, the wind had its say and kept it. The door rattled in the frame with each gust and settled again. June lay under blankets that smelled of lanolin and wood smoke. Trace rolled his bedroll by the fire. His rifle lay within reach by habit, and his hand found it and rested over the stock, not because of fear, but because years of nights had taught that hand to do that. Sleep came for her, and left, and came again in runs. In one of the thin places the old life crept in. She tasted whiskey that did not belong to her, and felt leather in the room, though there was none here. She took a breath that tripped her heart and raised her head. The cabin glowed low. Trace watched the fire with that stillness some men use as a shield. Her voice surprised them both. Trace, she said, do you ever hear a door lock in your head when there is no door? He looked over, and whatever answer he had first he left behind. Yes, he said. She nodded and lay back and let the answer sit like a warm stone against the cold. The wind hissed snow over the roof. The kettle whispered as iron gave up heat. The night thinned. In the dim before morning, June stood on her own and crossed to the hearth. She set the kettle back over coals and fed the fire with two small sticks. Trace sat up in his roll and watched her like a man checking the strength of a new beam with his palm. "Good," he said. The word held their small room in place. Snow ticked the window. Steam rose from the kettle in a thin, bright line. June wrapped her hands around a mug and let the heat climb into her wrists. The cabin smelled of coffee and smoke and damp wool. The white at the window held steady. The day could be whatever it needed to be inside this square of warm and stone and breath. By late day, the storm steadied into a soft, relentless fall. Snow pressed so close to the little window that the room was lit the way a hand glows when held to a lantern. The fire was a low, breathing thing. The kettle murmured. The scent of damp wool had worked into everything. Trace sharpened a short knife at the table. The stone made a clean rasp each pull. He worked slow wrist, easy eyes on the edge. June sat on the cot with her feet wrapped and raised on a stool. The flannel shirt warmed her shoulders. The trousers felt like a kind of armor that did not clank. She tried mending a tear at the cuff and lost the thread in the needle eye twice before catching it. Her hands had stopped shaking, but a fine hum remained in her, the kind that comes after running even when you have stopped. The knife stone paused. Trace lifted his head the barest amount. "Hurts," he said, not a question, not about the needle. "Some," she said. "Mostly it sits in my skin and watches." He nodded once and went back to the stone. The rasp set a rhythm that soothed and pricked both at once. They ate rabbit stew with sage and a heel of flatbread that took the edge off hunger. The stew put heat in places the blankets could not. June set her spoon down and leaned back against the log wall. The fire found a knot in the wood and snapped. She flinched and made herself still. Trace saw it and said nothing. He fed the fire a stick and set the kettle to one side where it would not boil hard. He wiped the table with the side of his hand and looked at the part of the floor that never seemed to come clean. Then he sat elbows on knees, hands loose. Night laid itself over the ridge. The little window went from milk white to a pale gray that showed snow caught in the corners of the frame. The latch sat easy. The beam leaned against the wall. June curled on her side and closed her eyes. Sleep came, dipped and slid away. When it took her, it brought a room with a locked door and the smell of oil on leather. Her chest tightened and her mouth dried, and she could not make sound. A shadow leaned and took up the shape of a man. Then the shadow changed. The smell shifted to cedar and smoke. A hand hovered near her hair and did not touch. A mouth found her forehead and rested there warm and steady, like a blessing that asked nothing. Her lips parted to answer something she had not heard out loud. She woke with her heart punching her ribs and heat slicking her nape. The cabin lay in quiet flame and shadow. Trace sat on the floor, his back to the hearthstone, head tipped up against the wall. The rifle lay close by his hand. His eyes were open. She turned on her back and studied the seam in the ceiling. The seam ran to the little window where snow packed the frame. Her breath went in and out like she had to show it how. The ring on her finger felt suddenly too heavy, as if the metal had found its own gravity. Trace shifted his shoulder. The shirt pulled and showed a line of scar that curved like a brand hidden under cloth. He caught her seeing and smoothed the shirt back down with a hand that was not quick and not slow. She pushed the blanket off to her waist and swung her feet down without thinking. Pain brightened for a heartbeat, then dropped to a throb that stayed in line. She stood. The room seemed to tilt, then it held. She took a step toward the fire and another. He watched her from the corner of his eye the way a man watches a young horse take a new slope. At the hearth, she set the kettle more squarely over the coals and held her palms to the heat. The warmth climbed into her wrists and up her sleeves. Her skin prickled where it met air. She looked at her hands and saw the little cuts cross-hatched like a map of roads no one should walk. "Trace," she said. He answered with his eyes first, then with a quiet June. She spoke like she was testing ice. "I do not know what I am." He did not fill the space. The fire popped and settled. "I mean," she said, and the words made a small tremor in the air, "I do not know how to be touched and not be hurt. I do not know how to be a wife or a woman or anything that lets someone close and does not lose itself. I do not know if something in me is wrong." Trace set his knife aside. He put his forearms on his knees and laced his fingers together to keep them still. "No," he said, and it had weight. "There is nothing wrong in you." Her mouth opened and closed once as if she might argue with that and had no ground. She came one step closer to him. The fire lit her from the side and laid shadow along her throat. "You said a thing," she said, "about not touching unless asked plain." He dipped his chin. "I meant it." "Why?" she said. His jaw worked once. He stood and crossed to the table not to put space but to find words. He rested his fingers on the edge of the wood as if the grain could steady him. Texas, he said. Years back. I was 17. Worked a stable, fed and brushed, walked a mare when she colicked, slept warm near breath. The rancher's wife stopped by the stalls. She was lonely. She liked to talk. I talked back about horses and wet years and how the river rode its own road down by the cottonwoods. He found her there with me once, and he made a story he could live with. He brought men. They brought a judge. He took a breath that sounded like gravel moving under a boot. The judge said my name out loud like it meant danger. He said I was a threat to women. They did not need proof when they had a brand and a boy with the wrong blood for their table. They put iron on me, hot as the inside of the sun, and sent me to swing a hoe in lines until I forgot the lines meant anything. When I got out, I swore I would not lay a hand on a woman unless she asked and made it clear, and no man alive could call it something else. He stopped. The fire made a sound like a cat purring in its sleep. Outside, the wind shifted, and snow slid along the roof with a hush. June reached for a truth she could use and found it. She came the next step. Her hand lifted and hovered. She touched the back of his hand where it rested on the table. His skin was heat and old work and the ridge of tendon. He flinched once like a horse does not, at a touch but at a memory. Then he was still. "You are too big," she said, and the words trembled out of her. They held fear, and something that was not fear. "But I want the bigness when it is you." His eyes shut. When they opened, they were the color of a sky about to decide if it will hold or break. He did not move closer. He did not move away. "What do you want?" he said, each word plain. She took his fist and worked his fingers open with both of hers. She placed his palm against her cheek. She leaned into it so the heel of his hand felt her heat, and the line of his thumb caught the line of her jaw. "This," she said, "and more when I say." He swallowed. He looked like a man who had been underwater a long time and had just found air. "God help me," he said, not to ask for anything, but because it came out. She guided him a step toward the cot. He let her. His fingers threaded into her hair and barely held. He lowered his mouth not to her lips, but to her brow. He rested there. He kissed the corner of her eye, and her temple, and the place where her pulse beat at her throat. Each touch asked a question. She answered each by leaning in and making a small sound that only he could hear. He hesitated and looked in her face with the kind of care that sees a thing whole. "If you feel fear," he said the words a little unsteady, "you say it. You push me off. You hit me. You stop me." She nodded. "If I cry, it may not be pain," she said. "It may be something leaving." He breathed out. His hand shook when it found the first button, so he stopped and let her unfasten the shirt she wore. The fire laid a slow light over her collarbone and the round of her shoulder. He drew the blanket up under her and over them both, and the cabin became a smaller room, inside the room its own weather. He kissed her mouth, at last soft, at first waiting. She parted for him. The kiss grew. It was clumsy and wet and perfect in a way that made her heart stutter. He stopped to search her face for any break. She shook her head and pulled him closer with both hands at his shoulders. He shifted to brace his weight on his elbows, careful about the line of her wrapped feet. He asked with his hands and with his mouth, and with the space he left each time he paused. She answered with touch, every yes clear. When she cried, he drew back fast, and panic cut a hard line across his face. "I hurt you," he said, broken. "No," she said. She caught his forearms and felt the strength there, and did not fear it. "It is relief. It is something coming out that has been pressing on me for years." He did not trust it right away. She held his gaze until he saw her, and not the room in Texas, not the wash, not the ranch. His mouth softened. His hands found a steadier path. They moved together in a rhythm that was new and exactly right for this square of space and time. The fire sank and lifted. The kettle ticked. Outside the window, snow layered itself against the frame. Inside, the wool held the heat, and the two bodies made more. He bent his head and said her name like it was a word he had learned long ago and was only now allowed to speak. She answered with his. Later, when breath had gone hard and then quiet again, he lay with his chest against her back, his hand at her hip. The ring on the little table caught a lick of flame and showed its dull circle. June set her fingers over his where they rested, and the two hands fit without force. Wind moved over the ridge and found the eaves. The door latch sat easy. The beam leaned where it had leaned all day. The little window held its square of white, and the fire kept its low, red heart. The wind let go of its grip and left the ridge dripping. Eaves ticked, icicles thinned to needles, and fell with a brittle music into crusted snow. The light went hard and clean, the kind that makes edges sharp enough to cut. Trace opened the door and stood with his hand on the jamb. The air that came in was cold and bright. June felt it touch her face like a cool cloth. The little window was no longer a slab of white. It showed a slice of sky and a black line of pine. South face looks scoured, Trace said. The pass might hold a horse. June laced the rope belt tight around the trousers and tucked the flannel into it. Her feet were wrapped and slid into shoes he had stuffed with rags. They fit like boats, but they kept the cold off. She tied her hair back with a strip of the old veil and kept her eyes on the knot until it held. Trace saddled Ghost under the eave. Leather creaked. Steam rose steady from the gelding's back. The bit rang once, a small bright sound. Trace ran a hand down the gray's shoulder, and the horse leaned lightly into it. He tied the rifle scabbard and checked the cinch with a tug. June brought out the small pack he had made, wrapped tight and light with food and an extra shirt and a tin that held salve and needle and thread. He swung into the saddle and held a hand down. June put her palm in his. He pulled her up behind him and set her sideways on the rump. Arms, he said. She wrapped them around his waist. His weight was a wall of warmth through wool. Ghost shifted into a walk that felt careful and ready at once. They took the back path through the black basalt. Snow had slumped in sheets and frozen again, so it broke under the gelding's hooves, with a sound like old crockery. The air tasted like metal and wet pine. The suns made the snow blink. June rested her cheek between Trace's shoulders and watched the world open in narrow cuts between rocks. On the south side, the wind had scoured the slope to a patchwork of polished ice and bare rock. Ghost found the line. The pass held. Down in the folds, the snow thinned to old drifts, and then to damp earth, then to mud that glistened in a way June had not seen in months. A raven rode a slow circle over the wash and croaked like a hinge. Trace did not talk much. When he did, it was simple things. "Step down," he said at a steeper cut, and she slid off and held the stirrup while Ghost picked his way. Trace dismounted only when he had to, and then only long enough to ease a hoof over a bad place before swinging up again. June climbed behind him and settled her hands where they had rested before. By afternoon, they came to ground low enough for willow and a stand of winter cottonwood. A path cut through it, rutted to hard edges, then filled with melt. Men had used it all winter. Hoofprints had frozen and held their shape. A camp sat where the path widened, and the land dipped toward a trickle of water. 3 tents. 2 burrows under a lean-to, a fire pit ringed with stones and a kettle going. The men there looked up and did not smile. Trace raised a hand without showing palm or weapon, then steered Ghost to a stand of brush and tied off. "Wait with him," he said. June slid down and stepped back into the brush shade with Ghost's warm flank to one side. She watched Trace walk to the fire with his hat low and his hands where a man could see them. He spoke for a minute. One of the men spat and looked at June and then away. Another lifted his chin toward the arroyo. Trace nodded once and his face went flat. When he came back, his jaw had a new line in it. "Riders were here," he said. 3, asking about a girl in a torn dress. Offered coin for any scrap. They found lace on the scrub east of the ranch. June felt the heat that had been working into her bones pull away. That strip of lace on a splinter came back in her eye like a moth pinned in place. Her stomach tightened. Trace took the reins and set a foot in the stirrup. "We get paper," he said. "Then we leave this lower ground." Hobbs's Crossing was a clapboard shack where 2 trails met and a third wandered off toward a seam of ore. A crooked sign hung by one nail over the porch. The letters had once read Hobbs, now they read HBBs in a shaky hand. Inside was heat and tobacco and a wet wool smell that pretends to be human. Men leaned on the counter and talked teeth out of their words. A stove clanked in the corner. Bottles caught the light on a shelf and made it look richer than the room. Rafe Milligan sat at a scarred table with a blotter, a bottle, and a ledger he did not use. His suit had been fine for someone bigger. It hung like a borrowed opinion. He wore a little pin on his lapel shaped like a star that had never belonged to him. His eyes were pale and tired and quick. Trace stood just inside the door and took the room in with one pass. "I need a paper," he said. Rafe smiled without his mouth. "That is wonderful. I sell them." Trace stepped closer. "A paper that says a woman is of age free to travel, not married to any man whose name is not on the paper." Rafe picked at a chip in the table. $50 gold, and I do not take pelts at the city rate. "We have 30, Trace said, and Fox." Rafe looked past Trace toward the door, as if money might walk in on the next hour. 50, he said again, and tapped the table with the back of his fingernail. It made a little wood music that said no. Trace's hand came open and then shut on some thought. He turned a fraction and looked toward the shadow where June waited. She stepped forward before he could give her any sign. "I will talk to him," June said. Trace's mouth opened to argue and then closed. He shifted to the side and let her pass in front of him. His presence stayed like a weight at her back. June went to the table and set down the fox and the 2 gold pieces and the silver they had scrounged. The pelts were clean and tight, winter-rich, and made a soft sound against the wood. Rafe's eyes warmed by a degree. "This is 30, he said. "I like 50. June kept her voice low, so the room would have to lean in to hear. "My stepfather is cruel," she said. "He hunts me. I need to reach kin north. This paper will keep men from selling me a second time." Rafe smiled wider as if he had heard a joke he could sell later. "I wish I could be moved by a story. The seal costs what it costs." June did not smile. "My protector is outside," she said. "He does not like rooms. He was branded in Texas for being the wrong kind of man to the right kind of people. If I go back out there and tell him, you would not help, you will not like the rest of your afternoon." Rafe's quick eyes blinked slow. For a breath he looked at Trace and saw the lines he had missed, the way the man held still and where he held his weight. Rafe wet his lips. He flicked a look at the pelts again. "A difficult seal," he said. "County marks might cost me ink I cannot replace." "I am sure you are very good at it," June said. "This is a gift for your time." Rafe pulled the ledger toward him and set the blotter at his elbow. He swept the pelts into a bag with one smooth motion, palmed the coin, and set out a blank with a margin in the exact foul shape of something official. "1 hour," he said. "Tell your protector to stay thirsty elsewhere." They waited with Ghost in the shade of a mesquite that offered more thorns than mercy. Trace stood and said nothing. He watched the road with his head a fraction turned to give his ear to the shack. June's hands shook only once. She set them on Ghost's warm neck until they steadied. Rafe handed over a folded sheet with a crisp edge and a seal that looked like it had been stolen from a courthouse. It felt like weight in June's palm. Trace tucked it under his shirt where it picked up his heat. They rode out with light still on the flats. The wind had a new bite in it that said night would be cold without the comfort of snow. The ground fell into a long, shallow gash they had crossed earlier without thinking. Now it had a feel to it that made Trace check the horse and raise his head. "Arroyo," he said quietly, "stay with me." The wash opened, and the banks lifted on both sides, rough with rocks and scrub. 2 riders showed themselves on the south rim like drawings snapped to life. A third waited ahead in the channel, his horse crosswise, the barrel of a rifle resting on the saddle's high fork. "Riggs sends regards," the man in the wash called. "Says thanks for warming his bride." Trace turned Ghost just enough to put the gelding's rump toward one bank and raise Ghost's shoulder toward the other, a little shield. June's left hand found the rifle stock by habit, then left it and reached for the second gun that lay in the scabbard on the far side. "Stay with the horse," Trace said. "If I go down, you ride." The first shot came from above and struck rock near their heads. It spat stone chips and dust. The sound hit after the chips. Ghost shied, and Trace set his heels and spoke to the horse, and the animal steadied. Trace fired back at the rim 1-2, to push a man's head down, not to take it off. He swung the rifle to crack the jaw of the horseman in the channel as the man spurred in. The blow sounded like a tree branch breaking. The man toppled and rolled and came up with a knife that held light like water. Trace dropped to the empty and went in without room for a second thought. Steel met steel, and then leather, and then skin. Trace moved like someone who had done this with stakes that did not bear writing. He was quick and mean with the edge, and he stayed on his feet. The knife man went still fast, staring at a place where sky should have been and was not. The crack from the rim came late in the fight. June saw the muzzle flash and felt the slap of the sound a heartbeat after. Trace sounded like a man who had been punched by a friend who should have known better. He took it in the high meat of the shoulder and staggered. Blood showed dark against flannel and spread. He lifted the rifle with his offhand and fired toward the flash. Wild but close enough to put a man's head down again. June dropped to a knee beside him and put the second rifle to her shoulder, the way he had shown her in the cabin, stock-tight cheek on wood. She did not aim at the men because her hands were not yet that sure. She aimed at the stone a foot to the left of the nearest hat. She breathed out and squeezed. The shot hit and screamed off in a shower. Chips spat into faces. One man swore and slipped on his own scramble. The other flattened. Trace said through teeth that held more than pain. He grabbed Ghost's reins and flung himself up in a way that used a lifetime of practice. His right arm hung wrong. He hauled June by her belt and shirt front into the saddle ahead of him and jammed his knees into the gelding. Ghost surged and found the line out. June bent low and felt the wind of a ball pass over her back. The rest bit dust behind them. They did not stop until Ghost's breath sawed and the foam on his shoulder went cold. Trace pulled up in a stand of pines where the ground was soft with needles and the air smelled like pitch. He slid off the wrong side and hit the ground on his knees. His face had gone a gray that made June's stomach go light. "Here," he said, and then had to stop to catch a piece of breath. Arm, high, through. June cut his shirt with the little knife and pulled the cloth away. The wound sat in the meat near the shoulder joint, ugly and wet, a hole where metal had gone in and a ragged exit on the other side where it had torn its way out. Blood ran and then slowed because it had taken what it could, and now it had to wait for more. "Bite," she said. She shoved his neckerchief into his hand and then into his mouth and did not watch his eyes for permission because they did not have time. She poured whiskey over the wound. It splashed and burned, and he jerked and groaned low. She washed her hands with the rest and sloshed both sides again. The smell of the liquor went chemical in the cold. She threaded the needle with the thick thread from the tin, cursing softly, when the end would not hold, then fixing it with a knot her mother had taught. She set the first stitch. The skin fought. It held like rawhide. Her fingers were clumsy and strong at once. She pulled and the edges met. She set another. Trace bucked hard, and then went still because he made himself. His eyes were open and looking at the sky like it could tell him how many stars there should be at this hour. "I am here," June said, and did not look up. "Stay, Trace. Stay." He made a sound low in his chest. The thread ran, and then she tied it with a flat knot and started on the other side. She talked without thinking about the words. She talked about the bread and the way the fourth piece had sighed when it came off the stone. She talked about Ghost's ear, the nick at the edge, and how it folded when he slept. She talked to keep him anchored. When she finished, her hands were shaking, and she had blood in the lines of her palms and on the heel of one hand where she had scratched at her own skin when the needle stuck. She wrapped him with strips torn from the flannel shirt where it was cleanest. She tucked the ends tight and set her palm over the bandage to feel the heat building there. That meant fight, not finish. He tried to sit up, and the world rolled him. She caught him with both arms and leaned him against a pine where the bark dragged the back of his head like a slow hand. His breath came in and out heavy and then less heavy. She put the last of the whiskey against his mouth, and he took a mouthful and swallowed it like medicine. "So," he said, slurred, "should have left. Not worth the rope you will need to drag me." She set one bloody palm on his face and turned him to her so he had to see her and not his old stories. "You are my worth," she said. "You do not get to say otherwise." Ghost lowered his head and nosed at Trace's knee, then snorted and stamped once. The pines moved a little and sent a hush through the needles. June listened for bells and dogs, and heard only the stir of the trees and the slow pull of a man still here. She pushed a bed of needles together and set Trace onto it so the cold would not climb into him from the ground. She pulled the blanket from the pack and laid it over his chest. She wedged the rifle within reach because that was how he slept, and maybe that would tell his body this was a safe kind of sleep. She rinsed her hands in a little pocket of melt at the base of a rock. The water bit her to the bone. He drifted and came back and drifted. Fever began its slow work, bright at first. June sat with her back to the same pine and kept one hand on his forearm so he would know there was weight there that was not a branch. The light lifted out of the arroyo, and there was that quick moment when the sky is metal and the ground is shadow. The air smelled like pitch and iron and the faint ghost of whiskey. June wiped her face with the heel of her hand and found grit and dried blood in the salt that comes from fear leaving. She looked at the paper tucked against Trace's shirt where it warmed and thought without words of seals and doors and how sometimes a thing that starts false can give you a real breath when you need it. She set her head back against the bark and did not close her eyes. June led Ghost by the bridle while Trace drifted against the saddle, his good hand tangled in the mane. The pines thinned to a shallow basin rimmed with willow. Air lifted in a steady, cool breath. The ground softened underfoot. In the valley beyond, houses stood white against winter grass and dark soil. Fences were straight. Barns were painted. Smoke from low chimneys rose in thin, calm threads. A man in a gray coat came from a gate and walked toward them without hurry. His hat had a broad brim, and his face was lined in a way that looked earned, not carved. He took Ghost's reins light in one hand and put the other under Trace's arm. "Friend," he said, "thee looks in want of a bed and a clean bandage." Trace tried to stand, and the world tilted. June reached for him, and the three of them made a knot that held. The man nodded once as if some test had been passed. "I am Ephraim Quill," he said. "Martha will see to him." They half-carried Trace into a room that smelled of wood soap and carbolic. White curtains let in a square of light. A bed with a clean quilt waited with the sheet turned back. Martha Quill was small and solid in a plain dress. Her hair was pinned up in a way that did not shift. She did not ask names. She cut away June's bandage with a pair of black shears that clicked once at each cut. "Strong hand," she said, touching the crooked line of stitches. "Heavy thread. Thee kept him here." She bathed the wound with a cloth that steamed and smelled sharp. Trace tensed once and then let it go. Martha's fingers were sure without being brisk. Ephraim held a basin and did not look away. June stood at the foot of the bed with her hands braced on the rail and her breath small in her chest. When Martha finished, she bound the shoulder with clean linen that looked like winter light and tucked the corners down with 2 quick motions. "Now thee eats, then thee sleeps," Martha said. She put a mug to Trace's mouth. It tasted of bone and onion and something green. His throat worked. His eyes closed and opened and then closed. June's body remembered what happens when you stop moving. Her knees sagged. Martha set a hand at June's elbow and eased her to a chair that had been waiting. A quilt smelled of sun and soap and was heavier than it looked. June pulled it to her chin. Sleep came without dreams. It fell like a quiet door. Days folded. June woke under a different roof and learned a new rhythm. She rose to the sound of wooden spoons and water poured into basins and the murmur of women who knew how to share a kitchen without talking about it. Hands passed her a cup and a knife. She peeled, she chopped, she kneaded. Flour hung in air and turned light to something soft. Her feet moved from hearth to table to the bench by the window, to the rack where clean cloths dried. When she looked up, Martha was beside her, wiping a bowl with a small dry circle, as if the bowl were a child that needed a face washed. Trace slept and woke and slept. Fever worked itself loud and then quiet. When he was awake, he watched the rafters and the square of sky in the window with the kind of patience a man learns when he has been made to wait. His hand found June's when she sat, and he did not ask for it. The pressure of his fingers said what words could not carry without dropping. Ephraim set him to small tasks when he could stand. He brushed a mare with careful strokes and mended a strap by lamplight. The stable took his weight the way a good tree takes a rope. On the 4th day, a wagon rolled in from the south. The iron rim sang over a stone, and the sound carried into the yard. The driver was a man with a sunburned throat and a hat that had lost the battle with wind. He climbed down stiff and spoke with Ephraim over the fence. June was shelling peas on the stoop. The bowl chilled her thighs through her dress. The peas ticked the enamel like rain on a tin roof. The driver's words came ragged with road dust. "Posters up from Taos to the line," he said. "Half the territory papered. A branded half-breed named Walker. Abducted a man's wife from her marriage bed. 500 in gold for his head, and the woman returned to her owner." The bowl slid from June's knees and hit the step. Peas leaped and rolled bright green over the boards. The sound of them dropping knocked a little open place in her chest and let cold in. She left the bowl where it fell and walked to the barn with her hands at her sides as if she were going to reach for something that had not been built yet. Trace was in the aisle, a curry comb in his left hand. The gray mare leaned her neck into the strokes. He looked up. His face was clearer than it had been, and then it was not. "They know," June said. "They made it a paper and gave it a number." Trace stood without setting the comb down. His body went very still. He glanced toward the western fence where the world turns thin. He set the comb on a peg and wiped his hand on his shirt, even though there was nothing on it. "I turned myself in," he said. "No," June said. He reached for the halter hanging on a nail and held it, because he needed to hold a thing that had shape. "They will take you if I do not," he said. "If I do, they might let you go on. You can tell them I took you. You can say I hurt you. They want that story. They will believe it. Riggs can put his name back on you and you can live." June stepped close and the halter strap brushed her shoulder. She set her palm to his cheek. He had shaved that morning, with a dull blade and a steady mirror. The rough still lived under the skin. His eyes did not slip off hers. "I will not tell those words," she said. "They are not true. I will not breathe them into a room to make men comfortable." He swallowed it, and his jaw worked once. "I was made for a rope anyway," he said, too quiet. She struck him. It was not a hard slap. It was enough to stop the lie from making a nest. Her hand stung. "You were made for a horse and a stove and a field and a door that opens," she said. "Martha's door. Our door. You cannot give me back to a lock to save me." He stood and let the words hit and did not move to catch them or dodge them. His eyes went to the rafters and back to her. The mare rested her chin on his shoulder and breathed out. Ephraim stood in the barn mouth with his hat in his hands. He had the kind of stillness that carries weight. His eyes went from one face to the other, and he nodded as if a bell somewhere had rung at the right time. "Thee has a matter for a judge," he said. "We have asked Judge Silas Merrick to sit here this week. He rides the circuit. He is a hard man, but he hears women when they speak. Thee can stand and tell him a true thing in front of folk who will not pretend they did not hear." Trace's shoulders changed shape like he had put a pack on. June closed her hand over his again. Her pulse beat there. It beat in her throat and in her tongue. Something old moved inside her ribs and shifted to make room for breath. Martha's voice came from behind them, level as always. "Come to the kitchen," she said. "Wash. Then thee tell us everything. We will need the whole of it, not the part thee practiced." June did not look at Trace and say she was sorry for lying about a stepfather. She did not say she was afraid. She carried the words to the table and set them down with her palms flat on either side as if they might slide. Martha poured coffee that tasted of roast and patience. Ephraim sat with his hands folded and his head slightly bowed as if for grace. June spoke. She told the script in the red ledger and the smell of leather oil and the peg by the wardrobe. She told the key turning and the match that stung her throat and the chair legs scarring the floor. She told the glass in her skin and the wet cold that made her want to sleep forever and the hands that lifted her into a saddle and the voice that said, "Safe in a room cut into stone." The words came like water that had been held too long, rough and then clearer. Her voice broke in two places and held in the next. Martha did not move except to touch June's knuckles once when they whitened. Trace sat and heard himself called a rescuer and a man with a brand and a thing worth more than 500 in any coin. He did not like the way his chest felt when he heard it, so he breathed slow, and let his hand on the table find June's under the edge where no one could see if they were not looking. Ephraim's eyes closed for a moment and opened. When June finished, the room held her words. The clock on the shelf ticked in a small way, a habit it had learned from years of plain afternoons. Martha set her cup down with a click a little louder than that. "Eat," she said, "then thee wash thy face. Truth takes a body to say it." June ate spoon by spoon without tasting. She wiped her face with a cloth that smelled faintly of lye and mint. When she looked up, Trace was watching her, like a man standing at a gate that had just been unlatched. Outside, the valley lay square and still. The light had a thin edge to it that made every fence line draw sharp in the eye. A wagon rolled past, and the driver lifted 2 fingers from the reins in greeting. Somewhere, someone planed a board, and the shavings curled like pale shells. June breathed air that tasted clean and cold and full of work. She set her hand on the doorframe with her fingers spread. The wood was smooth from years of palms passing. It felt like a door that opens. The meeting hall wore its Sunday quiet on a weekday. Benches faced a plain table. Light dropped in through high windows and flat bars that turned dust to lace. The room smelled of scrubbed pine and wool, and the faint ghost of tobacco that men had brought on their coats and did not light inside. Judge Silas Merrick stood at the table with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm. He was tall in a way that did not show until he moved. His beard ran iron gray to a point. 2 territorial marshals posted at the side walls, hats off hands, easy eyes, not. A Bible lay on the table beside a small wooden mallet and a stack of folded sheets with red ribbon tails. The mallet was not for show. Merrick rapped it once, and the room fell the rest of the way quiet. Ephraim and Martha Quill sat in the first row with other friends, their plain clothes making a slate line. Ranch hands and freighters filled the back benches, boots set careful on clean floorboards. June stood near the table, with her fingers locked at her waist. The gray dress Martha had found for her fit like it had been waiting in a trunk for a reason. Her hair was braided to keep her head clear. Trace took a place at the back wall, shoulder near the door, like a man who keeps exits in mind without making them a plan. His arm was bound under a clean shirt. He looked at June and nowhere else. The doors banged open. Barlow Kane came down the aisle with 3 men at his back. His suit was the same black it had been in the church, but the heat in his face made it look purple at the edges. His boots struck board hard and sure. He did not touch his hat. "Judge Merrick," he said, voice thick, "this is nonsense. The woman is my wife. That man stole her from my home. I have a marriage certificate on file in Taos County and a warrant to prove it. I demand my property and the prisoner." Merrick did not look up for a heartbeat. He finished a note with a slow, exact hand, then raised his eyes and let them settle on Barlow the way a man counts a horse's ribs. He rapped the mallet once. You will be heard when it is your turn, he said. Until then you will sit. If you cannot sit, you will stand silent. Barlow's mouth tightened. One of the marshals shifted his weight on the board. The sound was small and sharp and did what it needed. Barlow sat the bench complaining under him. His men followed, hands on their knees, eyes moving the way men's eyes do when they look for exits that are not doors. Merrick nodded toward June. State your name for the record. June Hart, she said. From Mesquite Bend. Do you swear to speak what is true as you know it? I do. Tell the court how you came to be here. June felt the room lean toward her. She let her hands unclasp and take hold of each other differently. She looked at the table, then at Merrick, then into the empty air just above his left shoulder, where her words would have to hang a moment before anyone would believe them. My father is Reverend Jonah Hart, she said. Barlow Kane held the note on our house and the church. The ledger was red leather. He set it on the pulpit on my wedding day and never opened it. He did not have to. The number was in the air. The church was full but quiet. Merrick's pen made one short sound. He did not look down. June's voice steadied. We said vows. I said the word small. The town did not sing. Mr. Kane walked me from the church to his house in the heat. He took me to a room with a bed and a washstand, and a wardrobe with a mirror that made me look like I was underwater. There was a quirt on a peg beside the wardrobe. The drawer in the nightstand was open a finger. I seen polished steel inside. Cuffs. He locked the door and turned and told me to take off my dress. I lit a candle because I could not breathe. When the light showed me the belt and the cuffs again, I threw the picture at the wall and pushed a chair through the window. The glass cut me where it could. I went through and fell into dirt where roses had been and ran. She stopped because the memory ran her. She caught her breath and set it down again. I ran to the wash and the ridge and lay there and got cold. A man found me. Trace Walker. He took me to a room cut into rock and warmed me and washed glass out of my feet and wrapped my hands. He gave me water and did not touch me anywhere I did not ask. When I could stand, I put on his shirt and trousers so I could move. When the snow let up, we rode south to get a paper, so no man on the road could sell me to another. Men hired by Mr. Kane found us in the arroyo. Trace was shot. I sewed him shut with a needle I had, and we walked north. The friends took us in. That is the whole of it. Her voice did not rise or beg. It laid out a path and left it. The room held long. Merrick's eyes had not left her face. He turned his head a fraction. Mr. Kane, he said, stand. Barlow stood with a body that wanted to loom, and could not because the room was too bright for it. He smoothed his vest. His mouth found a smile that looked like a line cut in wood. Judge, he said, you hear a girl's story spun by a branded man who has taught her to say the lines he needs. I have the paper, the certificate. I stood in a church, and the Reverend put my ring on her hand. What happens between a man and his wife in the house he provides is his business. She broke my window and ran, and this fellow took her and raped her, and now he stands here, and you let him look like a hero. Merrick did not look at Trace when the word fell. He did not look at the friends. He watched Barlow as if he were reading sign in dust. Sit, he said. Barlow laughed a dry sound. If you are a judge of sense, you will hand her back and shackle him to your mare. Merrick's eyes moved to one of the marshals. The marshal crossed the room and stood within arm's reach of Barlow without touching him. Barlow's jaw worked, and quiet came back. Merrick turned to June again. Mrs. Hart, he said, did you consent to be Mrs. Kane? No, June said. I said the words because of a red book and a locked door in the air. I did not consent. Was the marriage completed in the bed you described? No. Merrick wrote 2 short words on the topmost sheet, set the pen aside, and looked at the back of the room. Mr. Walker, you stand accused on paper as a kidnapper of a lawfully wedded wife. Did you take this woman against her will? No, Trace said. Did you touch her without her asking it? No. The marshal near Barlow shifted, and the floor gave a little creak. Merrick looked at the seal on the top sheet, then at the ribbon, then at June's hands on the rail before her. He reached for the folded paper that lay on the table with the feel of counterfeit. The letterhead had a county mark that was almost not quite right. This paper that says June Hart is free to travel is not a thing I will lean on, he said. He held it up between finger and thumb and tore it across once. The sound was clean. He set the halves aside as if they were not terrible or precious. We will decide on the facts we have made here. He pushed the Bible a fraction toward June, and then did not ask her to touch it again. He folded his hands. This territory is not a place where men can write a debt across a woman's back and call it marriage, he said. Contract requires consent, and a marriage requires both consent and consummation. You have testified to the absence of both. I find your testimony plain and consistent. I find Mr. Kane's control of your house and your father's fear consistent with coercion. I find the presence of restraints in a bridal room disgusting, and yes, that is a word I am allowed to use and relevant to the question of free consent. The ranch hands at the back bench looked at their boots. The friends did not move. Barlow's color changed not to red now, but to a dry pale that had no place to settle. Merrick lifted one of his own sheets, wrote with a pressure that left grooves in the paper, and spoke as he did it. I declare that no lawful marriage exists between June Hart and Barlow Kane, he said. I annul any pretense to the contrary. I instruct the clerk in Taos County to strike record of that certificate, and note the ground's absence of consent and consummation. I further order that any warrant for kidnapping concerning Mr. Walker is null, since one cannot steal what is not property, and cannot carry a willing woman from a man who never had legal claim to her person. Marshal removed Mr. Walker from custody of any paper declaring him a kidnapper, in this hall or out of it. The marshal by the wall gave a short nod. The other took his hand off the butt of his pistol and let his arm hang. Barlow tried to speak. The sound he made did not contain words. He leaned over the bench as if he might lift it and throw it. One of his men, the smallest, set 2 fingers on his sleeve. Barlow jerked his arm free. You ruin a man's rights, he said, low and ugly. You make yourself bigger than a church and a law and my house. This is not over. Merrick looked at him with something that was not anger and not pity. Sit with your not over, he said. If you stand again out of turn, I will have you put outside and leave you in the snow for a spell while the law works where it is warm. Barlow looked to his men. They looked at their hats. He pulled at his cuffs like a man who has been held and wants to feel some cloth bend to his will. He stalked up the aisle and out his boots, striking the floor too hard for the room. The door took his force and swallowed it and then swung shut with a quiet click that sounded like a finished thing. Silence held. Then the sound of a bench leg dragged when someone stood to go and then sat back down, unsure of what sound belonged here. June had not moved. Trace had not moved. Martha's hand came to rest on June's elbow. Just wait, nothing else. Ephraim bowed his head for one breath. Merrick signed his name and sanded the wet ink. He folded the page and tied it with a strip of red ribbon that had been cut, not torn. He set it in front of June. This is not the end of anything I can promise beyond what the paper says, he said. But it says what it needs to. You are free by law. Go as you will. June did not reach for the ribbon. Not yet. She looked at the judge at the table at the door that had shut so neatly. She turned and found Trace's eyes at the back of the hall. He looked like a man who had been held under and had just learned what air can do inside lungs. Merrick rapped the mallet once more. The room loosened around the sound. People stood and did not talk. The friends rose without scraping benches and filed toward the side door that led to coffee and a long plain table. Ephraim took the folded page and held it the way men carry a small fire. Martha stayed at June's side until June moved, and when June moved it was with a breath that had not been possible yesterday. Trace crossed the hall without hurrying. He stopped a foot from her and took off his hat in a way that felt like prayer without words. June's hand rose, then fell, then rose again and found his. The paper lay between them on the table ribbon, bright against worn pine. The window let in winter light. The simple room held a new quiet that felt earned. The mesa had a rim like a knife and a view that would not end. Pine stood in a clean stand above a spring that ran out cold from a cut in the rock. When the wind laid down, you could hear the water talk to itself. Ephraim walked the line with Trace and June, one hand on his hat brim and the other in his coat pocket. He named fences already standing and a corner where a marker stone rose like a tooth. Thee pays in work, he said. Put posts, mend ruts, help at harvest. We will write the rest when there is a table to do it on. Trace set his palm to the bark of a pine and felt the slow life in it. June crouched by the spring and let a palm drink. The water bit, then sweetened. She looked at the far plains as if the land were a book, and she had found her place on the page. They moved up first with what could be carried: hammer, crosscut saw, 2 axes, a coil of rope. Ghost pack sawed the rest from the valley. The ground where they would set the house was gritty with old sandstone. Trace cut brush to bare the earth and pinned twine to show the corners. He laid stones under the first logs so the wood would not drink water and rot. He started the notch at the end of a timber, and the sound of the saw teeth set a pace to the day. June hauled brush and stacked it in clean piles against a windbreak. She burned only what would not be good for anything else. Smoke went thin and kept the gnats away. She set a pot with beans and a heel of bacon on a flat rock near coals and gave it time. Trace swung the axe and the blows landed honest. His shoulder pulled once and he ignored it, then eased the swing and let the tool do more work. He drove pegs the way a man sets his own bones. At noon he leaned his back against a log and closed his eyes for a minute. June sat beside him and gave him coffee that had been sitting in the embers and had learned to be thick. He drank and looked at her without speaking. When the sill logs were set level and square, friends came. 5 men in plain coats and 2 women with baskets. They did not say much. They lifted. They pushed with pike poles. They made jokes that were dry as rope and cut the strain just enough. June handed out coffee in tin cups that had been polished by years of lips, and she set down cornbread wrapped in cloth so the heat stayed. Laughter came like quiet weather. By late day, the walls rose to a man's chest. Ephraim marked a door on the east side and drew a square with his knife for a window. June stood in that cut and looked toward morning. The light came at her clean and new. She brushed sawdust off her hands and felt it cling to sweat and stick like pollen. The roof went up, under a sky the color of a tin cup. They set the ridge beam with a rope sling, and men on each side who knew how to move as one. Pine pitch got in hair and did not wash out. The smell worked into clothes and stayed. Trace climbed with a bundle of shakes at his hip, and a hammer in his teeth set each shake with 3 nails and slid back 2 hands. His shirt stuck to his back and then cooled, and he did not feel the heat anymore. Martha came and stood near the hearth that was not finished yet. She laid a cloth on the raw plank table and set a loaf of bread and a crock of butter and a pot of apple preserves. June thanked her with her hands and a quiet nod. Martha pressed June's fingers with a thumb and looked around at the work as if blessing could be a glance. They slept on the new floor that first night, 2 bedrolls pulled together, 1 blanket over and 1 under. The house smelled like cut wood and damp earth and smoke from the small first fire in the stone box. The door was only a hung plank for now, and it swung easy on new iron. June reached in the dark and found the latch by feel. She set it. She slept with her palm resting on the warm part of Trace's forearm, where the bandage no longer was. Morning put a ladder of light up the wall. They ate cold beans and hot coffee and went back to tools. Trace split rails by the spring and carried them in bundles to make a square for a small pasture. He set the posts true and tamped the earth around them until it took his hand's mark. June packed mud and straw into the spaces between logs with both hands. It worked into her nails, and the brown washed half out, and then did not. When she finished a seam, she ran her fingers over it and felt the house get tighter. June picked a patch of ground by the door and broke it with a hoe. The dirt was thin at first, then sweet under. She worked compost from a pile that smelled live. Ruth had pressed seeds into her palm the day before. Beans, carrot, onion, a little packet of something green she had not used before, labeled in a tight hand. June folded each seed into soil and tamped it down with the flat of her fingers. She set small sticks where each row started and tied a strip of cloth to the first stake so the wind could find something to play with. Word reached out across the valley, and women stopped be on their way to and from other work. They brought eggs and news and questions they did not ask out loud. June kept a kettle going. She kept a broom near the door. She listened. Sarah came one afternoon with a bruise that looked like a door edge. She smiled too wide and said she had walked into a shelf. June poured hot water over dried leaves, and the steam lifted a farm smell into the air. "This pantry door," June said, looking at the cup. "Does it lock from the outside?" Sarah's eyes filled and blinked clear and filled again. Her hands fussed with the rim of the cup. "I can show you a judge who listens," June said, "or a road that goes north and does not talk." Sarah looked at the window where the east light fell in a square and laid itself on the table. She did not answer. She sipped. She let her shoulders rest for a moment, and then stood and tied her bonnet under her chin and went back into day. She left with a packet of salve and 3 eggs tucked in a cloth. June watched the path until the figure turned and was lost in willow. Trace found boys at the Quill stables who had been left by fever and bad luck. They watched the horses with a hunger that had nothing to do with bread. Ephraim asked Trace to help. Trace kept his face even and nodded. Silas was the oldest, with shoulders that had grown fast and a jaw already set for fights he did not need. He sent a mare to the end of the lead shank, with a cracked cue that sounded sharp. The mare's ears pinned and she came up light on the front. Trace reached him before he sent the next cue. He took Silas by the wrist. He did not squeeze hard. He made the boy look at him. "She bit," Silas said. "She is mean." "She is scared," Trace said. "Like you when everything is big." Silas tried to pull free. Trace did not let go. The boy looked at the ground and then at the mare. His mouth thinned. "You want to be big and fast and to make a thing move because you say," Trace said level. "Big is quiet, fast is how you breathe. You do not break a horse to feel full. You show it a way that is not work against work." He released Silas's wrist and took the lead rope. He laid it over his palm and let it hang. He stood where the mare could see his shoulder. He breathed until she matched him. He reached and scratched where the mane meets withers. The mare blew once and let her head drop an inch. Silas watched and his face shifted through the three expressions and none stayed. "Try," Trace said, slow. Silas copied the hand and the breath. The mare did not leave. She did not turn her eyes white. She sighed. The boy stood taller without trying to stand taller. Trace watched it and felt something in his own chest settle in a way he knew and did not have a word for. Nights had their old visitors. Trace woke once with his hand searching for a knife that was not needed and found the wool weave of a blanket instead. June took his hand and put it on her chest. "You are here," she said, eyes open so the words could be true. "You are home." Later, June woke with the smell of oil and cold metal in her mouth. She had no reason for it. She had every reason. She sat up fast enough to make the room pitch. Trace's hand was already there. He did not shush her. He gathered her and let her breathe into his shirt until the smell in her head changed to smoke and pine and the salt of his skin. They worked until their bodies turned the days into muscle and habit. Trace cut a window on the west wall. It took the end light and set it in a square on the floor. He framed shelves by the hearth and set a kettle hook. June lined the shelf with a scrap of cloth and set a jar of beans there because she liked how the glass caught sun. The pasture held 3 horses by midsummer. Ghost watched them with the soft eyes of an older horse who knows what a field is worth. Trace strung wire on 2 posts where coyotes had been clever and smiled at his own hand when the wire sang true. He did not say it out loud. June heard the small sound and filed it where she kept private victories. June delivered her first child with Ruth watching. It was in a sod house with a door that opened hard because of a winter that had swelled the wood. The labor came with the wide quiet that is more work than sound. June held the girl's hand and said nothing, but the things that matter when a body wants to stop and cannot. When the child cried, the sound shook dust from a beam and made a twig of light show itself where it had been hiding. June cut the cord with a clean blade and tied it neat. She wrapped the new life and set it to a breast and watched the jaw find the old skill. She stepped out and threw the basin water into the dirt, and the steam rose with a smell like iron and victory. Ruth touched June's shoulder. "Good," Ruth said. "Now thee come eat." Back at the mesa, evening found the house holding heat and the light lying long. Trace sat on the step he had planed smooth and watched the sky change to coins and then to milk. June brushed her hair by the door. The bristles whispered. The breeze came up the slope and cooled the sweat at her neck. "Fence is tight," Trace said. "Garden is up," June said, as some nem seed. He took her hand. The callus at the base of her fingers had a new edge where the hoe had made its own claim. He traced it with his thumb. She leaned into his shoulder with a weight that fit his bones. The door behind them stood open on hinges he had set himself. The latch was a simple loop and peg. The window facing east gave back the last light. The spring talked to itself in its small voice. A coyote yipped once far off and then thought better of it. The smell of pine pitch and hot dust and something green came together and made a night that could be slept in. Snow sank into the ground and left it darker. The spring ran louder where it broke from the rock. Wind lost its bite and learned to carry the smell of damp earth and green. June walked barefoot, where the grass came soft, the ground cold under the thin soles of her feet, the air warm on her calves. The garden lifted in narrow rows. Beans made hooks that found their own way. Onion tips cut the dirt like little knives. A strip of cloth on the first stake snapped and went slack and snapped again. June crouched and pressed 2 fingers to the soil. It held cool, then gave a touch of sun where the top had dried. She had been tired in a way that sleep did not mend. Morning brought a sour that was new. Her blood had its own count and missed it. She stood by the door, with both hands on the jamb, and felt her breath change. Fear came like a hard swallow. It spread into her ribs and found old places. She took a breath and held it until her lungs pushed back. Then she went inside. Trace sat at the table oiling the rifle with a cloth that had already given more than it had. The metal warmed under his hand as if it remembered the fire. He looked up and his eyes made room for her before his body did. "June," he said. She put both hands on the chair back. Wood took her grip and did not move. "I am with child," she said. The words felt plain and heavy like river stones set in a line. He was still for one beat, then another. The cloth fell to the table without sound. He pushed the chair back and stood. For a breath, his face held nothing but light. He came around the table and dropped to one knee on the floor that had learned their weight. He did not try for words first. He set his palm on her belly, warmed through the wool of her dress, and let the hand stay. "A child," he said, as if the sound might build a wall around the tiny fact. His voice broke and steadied. He bent his head and pressed his mouth there, beard rough lips, soft. "I will build a world for both of you." June let the air come out in a sound that was not a laugh and not a cry. She put both hands in his hair and felt the short, clean growth under her fingers. Her fear moved, not gone, but set where it could be watched. He stood and took her face in both hands and looked at her, the way he had in the cabin, when the snow pressed the window into a white square, and he had said safe and made it true. That night the house held a different quiet. Wind touched the east window and left. The spring talked under the day's noise. June lay with her back to him and his hand at her stomach. His breath moved hairs at the base of her neck. In the dark she told the small life what it needed to know, without teaching. Morning showed frost crusting the water in the pail by the door. By noon, it had turned to a skin that broke under a finger and was gone. June dug in the garden with a hoe while Trace split rails in a long, slow cadence. The baby made a new weight that pulled her low and changed how she stood. She learned the change. She sat when she had to and counted that as work too. She kept a sack of seed on the shelf by the west window. The paper scratched when she lifted it, a dry whisper. On the empty corner she wrote names with a dull pencil. Bean, onion, carrot, and then she wrote one more of the letter a little crooked because her hand shook and then settled. She smiled without anyone there to see it. In the valley, Ruth came by with a parcel of cloth and set it on the bed without talk. Martha left a jar of dried mint on the shelf and brushed June's hair once with her palm and was gone. Ephraim walked the fence line with Trace and said nothing about gaps because there were none. Boys at the stable learned to lead with slack in the rope. Silas rubbed a mare at the withers and did not flinch when the horse blew. He looked up and caught Trace watching. He shrugged and hid his grin and failed to hide it. The day the hills went green, Trace rode down to the friend's place to mend a hinge and fetch a sack of flour and a handful of nails. June stood at the fence and watched him go, Ghost stepping out easy, the saddle creaking the reins, lying sweet in a hand that knew how to hold without squeezing. She smoothed her palm over the curve under her dress and felt the firm rise there. Wind came up warm and took the smell of pine pitch and turned it to something sweet. Wildflowers opened in little flags along the path, blue and yellow and stubborn. June took off her shoes and stepped on grass that gave and rose again. The earth printed her feet and did not try to keep them. The sky had a clean edge. She saw him from far, a dark mark moving against the soft green. Ghost lifted his head when he topped the last rise and found the fence. Trace sat tall and loose hat, low a man at his right size in a place that fit. He nudged Ghost once, and the gelding slid to a canter that ate the ground in 3 long strides. Trace swung down before the horse had stopped. Dust rose in a small ring around his boots and fell. He came through the open gate and did not fumble the latch because his hands knew their work. He reached June in 3 steps. She lifted her arms and he took her. He did not lift her like a feather. He lifted her like something that mattered. He held her high enough that the wind could find the laugh already rising in her. The laugh surprised her. It was not small. It was not careful. It rolled out of her clean and carried across the grass and the raw rock and the timber. It held every mile and cut and breath they had made into a sound a body could make once it had room. Trace set her down slow. He rested his forehead to hers. His mouth found her mouth, a kiss that tasted of dust and coffee and the long road home. Ghost blew and shook out and lowered his head to the grass by the post rope, slack and easy. June put her hand on the doorframe as they went inside. The wood was smooth now, burnished by 2 palms. She felt the latch lift under Trace's fingers. The spring sang its small song. Light came in the east window and laid itself on the table, where a sack of seeds sat open paper, whispering at the round weight it held. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.